Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be. Welcome to our session of keynote speakers. I am Dr. Güler Kolbayram from Sinop University, Turkey, and I will be chairing this session. Dear participants, it is a great pleasure, honor, and privilege for me to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Sadia. She is a professor of intelligence systems in service and head of School of Hospitality and Tourism Management at University of Surrey. Professor conducts research on digital transformation in the travel and hospitality industry, investigating the applications and implications of intelligence systems in services to inform business practice and policy. Professor is Surrey principal investigator for the Peril project conducted by 2018-2022 and funded by Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, aiming to develop user-centering, privacy-aware data management platform to facilitate seamless, highly personalized travel experience for tourists. Before starting, I would like to remind an issue. After Professor's presentation, I would like to take your question, yes, Professor, this is your turn. You can start.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction, Dr. Bayram. It's really a pleasure to be here at the conference. I'm hoping that everyone has been enjoying the conference, and it's a fantastic event that's happening over there. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. So I hope it will work out. There we go. Display. Here it is. All right. So Before I start, so as earlier introduced, I'm based at the University of Surrey in the School of Hospitality and Tourism Management, and I'm also a fellow with the People-Centered Artificial Intelligence Institute at the university, which is a pan-university institute to study artificial intelligence, and with our mission to put people at the center of artificial intelligence. So if I remember correctly, I've actually managed to join the conference last year and talk about AI a little bit. So I'm thinking for today, I'm going to focus on the issue of privacy in tourism, and especially in regards to smart tourism. So with the increased applications of technologies and automation in tourism, how privacy is becoming a really, really critical issue for tourists that would influence also the ways we manage tourism destination. And with that, also, I will talk about nudging, which is a way for destination managers, governments, providers to influence tourists to whether share or not share their personal information, but essentially to ensure that their data sharing behavior online through different kinds of technologies would actually for their benefit. So nudging in this case is looked at as an intervention to ensure that tourists know what the risks are when they are sharing personal information in different situations with different kind of providers. So as mentioned earlier in the introduction, I'm heading up a project, which is the PREVELT, which is the privacy aware personal information and data management program, which is funded by EPSRC. So this is this forms a part of that project. So I'm going to start with this. As you are probably familiar, in the past, when we talk about privacy and security challenges in tourism, it has always been about, for example, hacks of personal information being stolen from providers' platforms. So, for example, Marriott hack, that was a couple of years ago, that hackers could steal passport information of guests, for example. And then there's also an idea of automation at border check, in the spirit of seamless traveler journey at the airports, and also in many actually parts of the customer journey. We start seeing a lot more of automation and artificial intelligence applications, for example, with facial recognition, right? So when you pass an immigration check, for example, you can just use your face to verify your identity. And so these were kind of privacy and security challenges we've already kind of discussed and tried to address in the past. But then when the pandemic hits, all of the sudden there's also this additional awakening, so to speak, that people start looking into it as part of surveillance. So you have the COVID-19 tracker, for example, and while everyone is aware that this is for the benefit of society, it's for the benefit of something greater than yourself. And to most part, I think people are kind of, how can I say, willingly share their information, because it will affect you directly if you have someone, for example, who's having COVID, and then you see the benefit of being contacted because of that. But then if we kind of marry these two together, in the past, you already have a lot of tourists already have this awareness of when you're sharing your data, you have to make sure that you share it with someone you trust, in this case, authority or providers. And there's also this trade-off between getting the benefit of convenience when you're moving around at the airport and so on, and also the benefit of something that's greater than just convenience, for example, for your health. And so there's a lot of compounding issues here that I think we need to consider when we talk about privacy. Now, most of the time we talk about privacy and security kind of in an interchangeable context. And I like the metaphor of a window to kind of differentiate between the issue of privacy and security. So, in your house, you have a window facing outside with glass. And so you have lights coming in. So you see the benefit of having a window. But then, there's also the risk that people could see through the window into your house, right? So, and that has two implications. One is on privacy and another one on security. And you see the difference. So with privacy, it means that, people will see what you're doing inside. And if you want privacy, meaning that you don't want people to see what you're doing inside, then the mechanism for you to deal with it will be a little bit different than when you're afraid that when people see through your window what's in your house, or if you are there, and they could break in and take something from your house, for example. So these two are different, right? So for example, if your concern is about privacy, you probably just put the curtain, right? You just close the window, close the curtain, and you don't, when you want to do something private. But if your concern is about security, you probably need a bolt, a lock. And so that's how we define privacy and security in the technological context as well. So there are ways for us to mitigate the risk of privacy, which would be different from how we mitigate the risk of security. So just very quickly, some emerging issues with privacy concerns in the tourism context. We know that technology develops very fast, and sometimes tourists are not very aware of what's going on in the technology space. And so a lot of them are not aware of what are the additional threats that come with a particular technology. So for example, if we think about devices, our concern with using our iPhone today will be very different than in the past when we are using not so smartphone, but then also the apps keeps changing. And for example, you're using your Fitbit or a smartwatch and things like this. And then there's also an inflated sense of urgency. When you are traveling, you're actually far away from home, and you don't have the resources that you need to search comprehensively of a particular thing. And then also when you are on vacation, your days are numbered, right? So for example, you're taking a vacation. Let's say I'm traveling to Turkey. I only have 5 days and I want to do this and that and this and that. I don't have a lot of time to actually search a lot of information. So there is that sense of urgency of getting information. And when the price of getting the information or getting an offer or getting a service is your personal information, then there is a tendency that tourists are more willing to share their information when they are traveling. There's also the idea of short-lived service experiences. When you're traveling, you're staying in a hotel, you're probably taking a taxi, you're going to a restaurant. Chances are you're not going to go to the same place again and again. You probably go somewhere else. And so there's that, a very short-lived relationship between customers and providers. And so that's why sometimes either you overshare or you don't actually develop enough trust. And so that will then compound also privacy concerns. There's also a lot of tendency that you're oversharing through your social media, or when you are interacting with locals, or now, for example, if you're staying in an Airbnb and you are sharing your personal stories, let's say, to your host because you feel comfortable, and sometimes that would then spill over to the digital world, for example, in the form of reviews and so on. So these are all added to the discussion and the magnitude of privacy concerns. Now, I'm looking at the state of the art. So what do we know so far in terms of privacy? And we're trying to actually, as a group, as a team at Prevelt project, we're looking into a comprehensive understanding of where privacy-related research has been in tourism. And so far, we're focusing on perceived privacy concerns, because that's the proxy of people's perception of privacy, or people's concerns about privacy. And so there are different theories of privacy concerns and how to measure privacy concerns, and also different types of antecedents, what drives people to actually, or to increase or decrease people's concern, and then the outcomes of privacy concerns. So if you have privacy concerns, how do that manifest in terms of behavior, whether it's protective behavior or more transactional behavior. Now, I have here a very, very simple, diagram, and this is the most used or the most utilized model in studies on privacy concerns. It's called the APCO framework, so antecedents, privacy concerns, and outcomes, APCO. So in many studies in information systems and in related disciplines, APCO has been used as a framework to actually understand what drives or what influences privacy concerns, and how privacy concerns then will manifest in behaviors or behavioral intention. And then actually looking into privacy concerns, there's actually a lot of interesting mechanism at play, and that, you know, when we look about when we think about concerns and also decision making, it's all about the cognitive and perhaps also emotional processes that influence people's concerns, right? So in this case, we are actually looking into biases that people have in privacy decisions, and these biases could be cognitive biases or actually behavioral biases because of something inherent to, I guess, human behavior and relationship. And based on this, we actually then look into how do we go about influencing people to make really responsible privacy decisions, and in this case, in terms of disclosure of information. So I'm just gonna perhaps talk about one area in terms of a theoretical framework in privacy concerns. And so one of the things that we used a lot when we tried to understand privacy concern is the privacy calculus. And so people are making a calculation in their mind when they are sharing their personal information. So for example, if you go to, if you book a trip, right? So let's say you're using a platform like booking.com, and they would like you to share your name, email address, and credit card information for payment, and that's fine. So basically what you are, most of the time that's fine. Basically what you're doing when you make the decision to book is looking into the risk and benefit of doing the transaction on that platform and looking at, okay, what kind of information they ask for me. And in this case, the assumption of the privacy calculus theory is that everyone is rational, right? So the decisions that you make is always rational. You're aware of the risk, you're aware of all the benefits, and then you calculate in your mind the relative, risk and benefit. So if you see the benefit outweigh the risk, then you make the decision in a favorable way. And then when you are actually looking into making a decision to disclose your personal information, and by personal information is all information related to you that could be used to identify yourself, then there's also a something called the dual calculus model. So in this case, that you have the privacy calculus. So for example, if you are so how much, for example, you're willing to be disclosed, and then also the risk calculus. So in this case, the calculation about how willing are you to actually take the risk. And so based on these two, then you make a decision. And actually, the third one, which is very, very important here, is called the privacy paradox theory. And I think if you are familiar with this area, you're probably facing this kind of issue all the time. And this is when people state that they have really high privacy concern. And while from the theoretical side of things, if you're concerned about your privacy, you're probably not willing to share your information, right? So higher privacy concerns lead to less likelihood of sharing information. But in many customers, there's the paradox where you state that you have a higher concern, but you share your data anyway. And so there is this inconsistency between what you think and what you do, basically. And we can go back to, I guess, the gap between attitude and intention in many different aspects of life and consumption. But again, from the privacy point of view, the privacy paradox is actually a very, very interesting and much more, how can I say, surprisingly very pervasive amongst customers. Now, some issues with privacy decisions. So when we are going back to the privacy calculus theory, we often assume that people are rational all the time when they make decisions, but actually it is never the case, or it's not always the case. And that is because most of the time we do have incomplete information about things, or asymmetric information. So what your providers tell you, for example, in terms of how they are going to collect and keep and use your personal data, sometimes you don't have a full picture of that. And sometimes it is not their fault. Sometimes it is just, customers a little bit too lazy to understand more about how the data is going to be collected and used. For example, how many of you actually read terms of reference? From when you click, when you install an app, they talk about privacy and how data are being managed and so on. And it's perhaps in, I don't know how many pages, and people just don't read, right? So sometimes that incomplete and asymmetric information also comes from the customers not willing to learn more about how the data is being used. Now, there's also the issue of bounded rationality. There's only so much that we can do to exercise our brain sometimes in decision making. And sometimes when we think that the decision making, that the decision that we make is not significant enough, for example, we turn to heuristics. We take shortcut. We don't have to think. We don't have to actually make a calculation anymore. Sometimes we just do it because again, the limitation of how we want to exercise our brain. It is not about how can I say the ability. It is more about sometimes the contextual factors. And there's also psychological biases to this. And I have another slide on this. And these are just examples of some of the cognitive biases we have as a customer when we are trying to make decisions to share our information. Let's take, so I have 4 here as an example: hyperbolic discounting, post-completion errors, framing effects, status quo bias. Let's start with status quo bias. So many individuals, they have the tendency to just, perform a habit. And it is really, really difficult to actually do something a little bit more differently. So they have this, default choices that you just do it. It's kind of, it's the usual thing. And so when there's something new, and or some added, let's say Facebook is a good example of this, right? So every time they have an update, you get a notification, and sometimes you have to go back to your privacy setting and click different things and agree to different things. But most of the time, people are just making the assumption that this is all the same thing. So that's kind of a status quo bias. And then post-completion errors in a tourism setting, for example. So this is the tendency that sometimes people forget the secondary tasks after completing the primary tasks. So for example, if you're traveling, you're staying in a hotel, you go to let's say you need to print something. Let's say you bought a ticket. Now I guess everybody is using their phone, but just for the sake of example, let's say you have to print something, a ticket to go to a concert, and you go use the business center. You go there, you log in with your information, you print, and so your primary task is to print the ticket, right? And so once you got the print, sometimes people forget that they have to log out from the computer, right? Or to forget to clear the history if you're browsing. And so so logging out is the secondary task, or at least you think of that as a secondary task because your primary task was to print. And so sometimes that also has, you know, how can I say, contributed to the privacy and security issue. So I'll go to the next one, or just so how do we go about doing this? How do we influence people then? So how do we make sure that people don't forget about their secondary task? How do we influence people to actually be a little bit more alert, or you know, not always think of how can I say, take the options that is beneficial in the short term, but forget about the long term consequences. And so that's when nudging comes into play. So it's a nudge theory from, you know, Thaler and Sunstein. Basically, it's a soft paternalism, and essentially you don't actually limit people's choice, but you influence them to take a more beneficial choice. So in our case, we want to do that for the benefit of the customers, not necessarily for the benefit of the providers. But obviously, you know, in some cases, the nudge would depends on who actually implement the nudge. So it is a form of behavior targeting, and sometimes it is in the form of choice architecture. So basically, we create a system in a way that the favorable choice will be chosen. There's an example that I'm going to give you. So okay, maybe very, very quickly an example. Let's say blood donation or organ donation. When you go to make your driver's license, there's an option, right, if you want to be an organ donor or not. So in the past, the default option is no, and you have to choose if you want to. You have to inform the officer if you want to be one. So to tick yes, and so then the take up was small. But when you change the default option to a yes, and that you have to inform the officer if you don't want to be an organ donor, then the take up increased. And so in this case, the choice architecture is basically manipulated, designed in a way that it makes it easier for you to choose the most favorable option. And so that's nudging. So the choices are still the same. You can say no or yes, but there's been a facilitation, so to speak, so that the most favorable option will be taken. So how do we nudge people? And this is related to privacy. How do we nudge people to be more responsible in their data disclosure? So there are 6 different dimensions. We can nudge with information. So, for example, to present to how can I say, to educate tourists. Educate is a little bit of a strong word, but essentially we give them more information about what's going to happen if they share their information, their names, email address, telephone number, fingerprints, face, and so on. So that's one. The second one is the presentation. So presentation could be in the way the framing of the message is presented to the customers. And then 3 is by default. So my example of organ donors is an example of defaults. If the default is a yes, then many people will not actually bother to tell the officer that they would take no. And then incentive, well, it's perhaps a little bit straightforward. So we give them something in return of sharing personal information. It could be a discount. It could be benefit or rewards. It could be something. There's a lot of debate actually in the area of incentive, whether it's considered nudging or not, because nudging, as I mentioned earlier, should be soft paternalism. It is not supposed to be changing or altering the socioeconomic benefits for the customers. And so sometimes when incentive involved cash or monetary incentive, it is very difficult to categorize whether it's a nudging or not, without actually looking into the context. So if you know, when, let's say, if a hotel is trying to get you more of your data, let's say, okay, share us your face image so that you will be able to use our facial recognition lock, let's say, around the hotel. And so in this case, the incentive will be maybe, I don't know, about 20% discount on the room rate. And if you can justify that as a way that, you know, it is a saving, you know, necessary, it is a saving that you can actually do by not creating keys and so on. And it doesn't actually influence a lot of the welfare, so to speak, of the tourist. And so that can be considered nudging. But for example, oh, share your face image and I will give you, I don't know, 100 pounds, let's say. That's a little bit, how can I say, questionable. So it's no longer nudging. It is just incentive. And then the other two are related to reversibility, meaning that their decision can be reversible. So it's like almost like an undo button. So allowing customers to change their choice. So that's also nudging. And then the timing of when you actually do the intervention. And so based on these, our project, we started with by looking into the research priority and how do we actually look at privacy in tourism, and especially with in relation to the idea of smart tourism. And so we found there are 4 things that I think are necessary for us to do. One is to measure privacy concerns in tourism. So specifically when you are looking at, for example, contact tracing and things like this, not in the context of tourism, we kind of understand a little bit more about people's concern. But then when we take tourism in the equation, when, you know, people are suddenly outside of their familiar environment, what are the contextual factors that influence privacy concerns, and can we measure the privacy concerns in the same way to the same individuals when they are at home or in a familiar place compared to when they are traveling? So let's say, is my privacy concerns here when I'm in my office in Guildford, I live in Guildford, will be the same as my privacy concerns when I'm traveling to Turkey, for example. So that's one. And then the second priority for us is to explore what will be the specific biases in tourist decision making. So we learned, about all the cognitive biases that basically standard generic across human decision making, across the spectrum of human decision making. Would tourists have, a different, how can I say, bias that adds to this, or how these biases manifest in traveling? And then looking into this, to us, I think it's important that we experiment with different privacy nudges, with information, with presentation, with default, and so on and so forth. And then after experimenting with these nudges, how can we then integrate these nudges into system design? So for example, if we're creating an app that requests people's information, how do we embed different nudges in them so that it will ensure the favorable choices that people have? So I'm going to share the first study that we did. So this is the privacy and smart tourism. This study is in collaboration with colleagues Paco Femenia-Serra in Spain and Athena Ioannou here in Surrey. So basically, we're looking at different types of privacy risk that people attach to smart tourism. And also we're looking at the levels of awareness. Are people aware of different risk attached to different technology? And we also look into, with different kinds of devices that people use, and personally as an individual, and also systems operated by providers and authorities. How do they actually think about the risk of these technologies, and how these technology risk influence their privacy concerns? And then we were also looking into what kind of behaviors then are manifested through this process of privacy concerns. How can I say mechanism? So my colleague did an interview with tourists coming to Spain. So for example, I'm just going to read this one. So I only share information with companies that I'm aware of, high profile in the public eye. So this is basically a behavioral response to privacy concern. And he mentioned that any kind of website of companies I'm not aware of, I just try not to share with them, because if I don't know something, I don't trust. I just trust the big ones. And so this is basically an illustration how people are being selective, first of all, in terms of sharing their personal information. And the behavior could be different. So they disclose only to providers they trust, and that they don't disclose information to companies that they don't trust. It is interesting, though, that this person in particular is trusting more of big companies, but less of smaller unknown companies. So our question is like, it's smart scary. So this is the framework that we're looking at. We look at technology risk and how that influences privacy concerns. And then with privacy concerns, we test the disclosure intention, and then also the impact on privacy protective behavior. So privacy protective behavior is basically a way of people avoiding, or mitigating privacy concerns by not disclosing their information. Just very, very, very quickly to share with you. So we asked them a bunch of different information. So for example, credit card information, social media content, face image, heart rate, stuff like this. And so we're basically looking at identifiers, so things that identify you, so your email address, your education, hobbies, and so on. We also look at biometric information, so that's your fingerprint, face image, heart rate. And transactional, in this case, credit card information. And so as you can see, so the yellow is authorities, the gray are DMOs, orange online booking platforms, and then the blue are local providers. So local providers include, for example, a restaurant or a hotel where they are staying. So overwhelmingly, people trust or people disclose more information to authorities. So because perhaps these are the people, the entities they trust the most. And so it's interesting, for example, in face image here and fingerprint. So most of them, they indicate, well, it's actually a little bit below the neutral one, but more of them are sharing or tend to trust more of the authorities than the other entities. But for things like credit card information, you see that local providers here are higher than the authorities. So I know this is very, I'm just going to go through it just a little bit. So the only one that's not supported, the only the only relationship that's not supportive is the privacy concerns and disclosure intentions with DMOs, and with the rest is actually fine. And so again, this is a little bit of a surprise, but not really a surprise. Going back to the idea of privacy paradox, you can see that there is the tendency that even though you say that your privacy concerns is high, it doesn't mean that disclosure intention will be high. So sometimes people who are concerned about their privacy, they will actually share their information anyway. So some of the key insights from this, I'm conscious of time. I have about 5 more minutes. So tourists do not trust most organizations who are having access to their personal information, and they don't have really knowledge about data management policies. And as we can see from earlier actually model, that their concern is related to a higher predisposition to limit their disclosure of their data, and that the privacy protective behavior is manifested in their use of technology in travel. So many people tend not to use technology when they are traveling to reduce that risk of privacy. So in this case, the privacy protective behaviors we found are non-use of technology. So they don't want to use some devices, especially devices that are, from third party, from their providers, and also selective data sharing. So they only share their information with authorities, not authorities, but with entities that they trust. And then the second study that I want to share is about nudging. So this is we did a systematic review on different types of nudging. Remember, I mentioned about the 6 dimensions of nudging. So we want to know which nudging strategy are the most effective in influencing a privacy decision. I know this is a little bit small, but just to show you that we're looking at the idea of privacy. We're looking at literature, empirical studies looking at privacy nudging in privacy behaviors that how can I say that to drive a conclusion how much nudging has been effective in influencing this. And so this is part of the Project Preval, as mentioned before. So this work is together with colleagues in Sari, Dr. Athena Ioannou, Professor Graham Miller, and in Warwick and in Kent. Yes. So we're looking at 4 different subgroups. So one is looking into nudging with presentation. So this is that group. Nudging with incentive, nudging with information, and nudging with default. And I know this is very tiny, but these are basically, we did a meta-analysis looking at the effects of all these different nudging strategies to disclosure. Some key insights. We found strongest effects. So overall, there's a small to medium effects of nudging on disclosure behavior. The strongest effects we found for incentive and default intervention. So incentive is, when we offer them something, and default is when we kind of trick them into selecting a more favorable choice. Weakest effects we found for information and for presentation interventions. And again, I think that has something to do with, when we inform them about what's coming, I don't know if they are paying attention, or if we use the presentation in a different way, we're not sure if they're actually aware of all this. And we also found stronger effects of the nudging on increasing disclosure than those on decreasing disclosure. So if we nudge people to share more, it looks like it's more effective than if we nudge people not to share personal information, which is quite interesting. And I think that has a lot of implications on destination management. And so that's almost the end of my presentation. So actually quite on time. And so these are some of the references that I use. And this is again from Project Prevelt, where we work together with University of Kent, Warwick, and Durham. And it's funded by EPSRC, and these are all our partners. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm going to stop sharing right now, and I'm happy to take questions, if any.
Thank you so much, Professor Rees, for your wonderful presentation. I take some notes related to your speech, and I hope many participants take some notes related to your presentation. I would like to ask a question, and by the way, I'm waiting to participants' question to our speaker related her presentation. I would like to know what is your opinion about metaverse and the tourism relations, and with the context of privacy and security for future tourism, Professor?
Yeah, I knew every time I go now, this is the nth time that I get asked about metaverse. Even though I didn't mention anything about it. Yes, it is an interesting area to how can I say, an exciting things to anticipate. We actually don't. I have to say, many of us are not in a full understanding of what the metaverse will look like yet, right? But the promise, by like Microsoft buying all these gaming company for billions and billions of dollars, and the fact that Facebook changed their company name into Meta, we know that it is coming. The metaverse is something for us going forward. But obviously, I think the first, just like what virtual reality did in the past, I think the first area that will be influenced, or how can I say, that we will see engagement from customers in the metaverse is gaming. And I mean, to be honest with you, I think that's already happening anyway, right? But what's exciting for tourism is the idea that now we can actually create something for us to sell, and that has been something we were not able to do in the past with all kinds of virtual worlds, is to create immersive experiences that are worthwhile, or there's a monetary value to it. So I'm always an advocate for replacing parts of travel, not all of it. I think before the pandemic, we tend to travel too much. And so there are areas where I think, the metaverse will be able to help us with replacing some of the experience, the travel. But I think the how can I say, the homework is still the same, right? So for destination managers, it's really about creating experiences that's worthwhile and has a monetary value to it, so that you don't actually, how can I say, you don't spend too much resources on something that would be, how can I say, that would take away from developing real, how can I say, offerings that your customers would actually enjoy. So and with privacy, again, obviously now you have with the metaverse, you essentially have a second, how can I say, world, right? Where you have different identity. You choose to be somebody else. For example, this is your first, this is my, this is ease for number one, and then I can create ease number two in the metaverse. But we know that it's linked. So whatever we do in the metaverse would then influence or add on top of the identity that you have in the real world. And so I think to me the risk of whatever is going to happen to metaverse, the risk is that only certain players will have enormous access to your personal data, and that they will become really, really powerful. So I think the fact that Microsoft, is doing that, how can I say, bought this realms of gaming, and then Facebook is trying to do so. So what I'm worried about going forward, if let's say they are successfully in developing a lot more significant activities in the metaverse, is that they do have access to an enormous amount of personal information, not only is versus one, but also is versus two, version one and version two. So yeah, so there, I think for destination management, it's kind of a wait and see at this point, and maybe, I don't know, I'm a little bit of a skeptic. But yeah, so going back to privacy, yes, there's that implication. So to me, the implication is that, big players will have, and in this case, private companies will have an enormous amount of your personal information.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Is, for a kind answer. I'm looking the chat box if there are questions from participants or any suggestions, and I can see, yes, any question. If so, we can finalize our session. Professor Is, do you want to say something or add in something to us?
So I think I'm talking about perhaps what's the homework then for us if we are, let's say, looking at the spillover of surveillance, in the, let's say, going back to the metaverse idea. Perhaps looking into the different dimensions of personal data that you share in the digital world. Let's say if you're doing a lot of, I don't know, gaming and then shopping, and then the idea of maybe like going to Paris to have in the metaverse to have a coffee outside, a cafe, for example. And so in addition to transaction information that then whoever dominate or control the metaverse will actually know, it's perhaps looking into whether tourists, let's say if we are an actual tourist, the way that we behave, the way that we transact, the decisions that we make will be different compared to when we are traveling in the metaverse. That's probably something that's interesting to start thinking about, right? So do we perceive that we have a lot more freedom if we are doing it in the metaverse? Or what are the cognitive biases? How are we, how can I say, are we more concerned about surveillance when we're in the metaverse? Is it because it's difficult to hide, right? So you're in a digital world. It is, unless you know how to trick the system, you probably don't know how to hide. And so I think the effect of that perceived surveillance and could translate into that. So something that perhaps interesting to do research on more.
Thank you so much, Professor Is, for wonderful presentation. I saw many prizes to your speech and
Thank
kind
you.
directions. I would like to finish our session. Thank you so much, dear participants who show interest to our session. Thank you so much to organizing team for excellent speech. That's all. Have a good day.